Hi, and welcome back to another Quick Gen video. Every once in a while, I wonder if maybe at some point I should do some sort of introductory video, like say something about myself and my relationship to these books, most importantly, why I chose to talk about humor and Malazan. And then I started working on my Kindly and Pores video, and I realized that really everything I wanted to say was contained in the story of these two characters. I'll include a link to that video if you haven't seen it, but it's not really necessary to watch it first. My first Kindly and Pores video was focused entirely on a single aspect of their relationship. But my original plans for it actually included a much wider discussion that I said I might come back and visit in the future. So this is the future, and this is that video. And it's gonna go wider, a lot wider, possibly too wide. But I think it absolutely is a companion piece, and in a way, it's also a culmination of my videos on the Bone Hunters. This is my 6th video on humor and humorous characters in Malazan. And so far, I have covered the hilarious topics of addiction, extremism, gender and sex, intelligence, and the complexity of parent-child relationships. Almost seems like maybe I've got this whole humor thing all wrong. Or maybe Erickson does. I've certainly heard the argument that the use of humor is inappropriate in the context of sensitive or painful topics, so maybe. Or maybe humor can be found in complex topics because humor serves a deeper purpose than simple silliness or comic relief. And exploring that purpose is the reason I chose to focus on humor, and why, in particular, I find myself drawn to the humor of the Bone Hunters. Kindly and Pores are like two characters that walk directly out of Catch-22 and into Malazan. Or maybe it would be more accurate to say that if Kindly and Pores were to show up in the pages of Catch-22, they wouldn't be out of place. If you haven't read it, Catch-22 is a satirical novel by Joseph Heller that follows a group of soldiers during World War II and is regularly included on lists of the best fiction from the 20th century. I'm going to focus on Malazan today since that really is what this is about, but if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. Suffice it to say that a captain yelling at a wounded soldier for lying lazy in a hospital bed, or a master sergeant using bureaucracy to support his personal enrichment through the buying and selling of supplies, or the aide who reduces a page-long communique to 7 words, are all Kindly and Pores scenes that could just as easily exist within Catch-22. There's often an absurdity to the interactions between Kindly and Pores and within the Bone Hunters that echoes the irony and dark humor found in post-World War II fiction. So that means we get to do a quick, vastly oversimplified review of war and literature in the 20th century. The Malazan soldiers may primarily carry swords and arrows, but the use of magic and Maranth munitions mean that war in their world has much more in common with modern warfare than it does with pre-industrial war. And those parallels, I think, are intentional. The horror and the inhumanity of modern warfare is a recurring theme in the series. Industrialized warfare changed our world, and so, of course, it changed our literature too. After World War I, American soldiers, like those the world over, came home disillusioned and traumatized by their horrific experiences with trench warfare. And so writers and artists among them pushed back against previous works that had used flowery prose to tell epic stories of war and glory. What they had witnessed was not glorious, so instead, they adopted a more clinical approach in order to describe the atrocities that they had seen and used a minimalist approach to the use of language that expected the reader to infer intent and themes and meaning within the text. They stripped the language to its bare bones. And while no one can accuse a 3 million word series of being minimalist, any reader of Erickson's work will recognize both of these techniques in his writing. So if that generation stripped language to the bare minimum until nothing was left but the raw, bleeding bones, then what's left for the next generation? When everything else has been taken from us, what remains? How do we survive? For many of those returning home from World War II, the answer was humor. In response to the horrors of the Second World War, authors like Heller and Pynchon and Vonnegut turned to irony and satire and absurdism to find meaning in the meaningless. When everything is snafu, which is an acronym that stands for Situation Normal All Fucked Up and originated with American troops during World War II. Sometimes, like any undead jaghut can tell you, all you can do is laugh. For the Malazan soldier, laughter is how they remind themselves that they're still alive, and it's what makes living bearable. For these soldiers, humor is not simply a distraction, it's a way of connecting, of surviving, and it matters. To experience war is to experience trauma. Unlike the soldiers in our world, Malazan soldiers don't carry guns, but there is one weapon that both groups have in common when it comes to the fight for survival, the kind that takes place in their minds before a battle and the kind that comes after the battle is over. And those soldiers find themselves still alive when so many of those that they fought alongside are not. It is humor that can act as both their sword and their shield. We first see this with the Bridgeburners. In Catch-22, Yossarian claims that in war, the enemy is anyone who's going to get you killed, no matter which side he's on. That might not be as catchy as First In, Last Out, but this could just as easily be the Bridgeburner motto. That lack of trust in the intentions and competence of others, particularly superiors, defines the Bridgeburners, and it's evident in their humor. Like a sword, it's often sharp, used to attack, a test that has to be passed by others. And yet, as enjoyable as that humor often is, it serves primarily to illustrate the history and the bonds between these soldiers, without ever really making us feel as though we're a part of that history. Which is why, for me, it carries so much more weight when we see the humor used between the bone hunters. Because unlike with the Bridgeburners, we are with them from their inception to the end. We're there for the source of the inside jokes and the creation of the stories and legends, the bonding between the characters. And this is where the Book of the Fallen diverges from its post-war influences that I am presumptuous enough to claim exist, and in my opinion, where it shines the brightest. There is no flinching from the reality of the horrors people are capable of inflicting on one another. And there's often a great deal of irony and humor in its approach to such serious topics. This series transcends both of those literary traditions through what it's lacking, which is cynicism. These books might cast a critical eye on humanity, but they never do so without a sense of hope that we might become better. So let's go back to Kindly and Pores. The humor in their interactions is evident on the very first read-through, and yet on first impression, Kindly's treatment of Pores seems like the most cruel use of humor. He's constantly poking at Pores, sometimes hard enough to draw blood, and it's easy to see him as nothing more than a caricature of the unreasonable commander, abusing his power at the expense of his soldiers. In response, Pores, rather than fighting a system he's powerless to change, learns to manipulate it to his own advantage. On their surface, these are the echoes of themes found in 20th century war literature. But because we're able to go on this journey alongside the bone hunters, that impression changes as we realize that while Kindly's humor is very much a weapon, it's one that's wielded with the intention of strengthening the armor of his soldiers. And in turn, we see Pors, over the course of these books, learn to do exactly that, using humor as a shield against Kindly's attacks in a way that prepares him for the challenges he'll face by the end of the series. And yes, the humor can get dark. My favorite example is when Lieutenant Renal is blown up by munitions in House of Chains and Cuddle jokes that he is wearing Renal. And 5 books later, when Quick Ben seems to have been killed in the battle with the K'che Naruk, Cuddle tells Fiddler, in what is probably the best and darkest callback joke in the entire series, that Quick Ben got Renald. So I guess the obvious question for those who aren't fans of dark or gallows humor is why? Why do people so often seek to find humor in tragedy or to laugh at serious topics? For me, Cuddle saying that Quick Ben got Renald, or soldiers joking that those killed in the battle against the Naruk should have learned how to duck, are not displaying a lack of feeling. Instead, they're using humor to process and cope with those feelings. This is humor as relief from pain, which is perhaps the most powerful use of humor. It can be found among prisoners and hostages, in war, in poverty. There were even jokes among prisoners in concentration camps, and I can't find sources, but I have no doubt that slaves told jokes in the fields, which, note to self, Googling slave jokes is a very bad idea. But when faced with oppression and cruelty, humans have an amazing ability to use humor and laughter to survive and to rise above tragedy. So the use of dark humor in Malazan not only represents an accurate and very human response to the kinds of trauma its characters experience, it also provides a coping mechanism and stress relief for the reader. In addition, dark humor is a great way of offering perspective, of examining and facilitating conversations about difficult issues that are often considered off limits or taboo. At the end of Book 10, the Heavies and the Marines are entrenched at the top of a barrow, surrounding the body of the crippled god. It's the final battle, and they are outnumbered and exhausted. Most of them are about to die, and they know it. Of course, this is a work of fiction, and these are the good guys, and so despite the sense of desperation and dread, there's also that hope that somehow these men and women will find a way to overcome the odds. That expectation that the tide will turn and victory will be possible. What's exceptional about this scene, this final battle that is the culmination of 10 very big books, is that the moment when the tide turns comes before the battle even begins. And it comes in the form of a joke. Who are we fighting for again? Everyone. No wonder we're losing. Heartbeat, a snort, a chuckle, and then the floodgates open and every last man and woman on that hill are doubled over in laughter. They laugh so loud the assailed can hear their laughter rolling off the barrow, and it stops them in their tracks. The battle afterward is nothing more than a deadly formality, because this is the moment that the bone hunters won that war. It's also the moment that causes the crippled god to decide that he would write a book of the fallen. wasn't their courage or their sacrifice, but their laughter that inspired him. Hear them, he thinks. They are humanity unfurled, laid out for all to see. He listened to the laughter, and suddenly the weight of those chains was as nothing. Nothing. Only the fallen can rise again. But it is the sound of laughter that allows them to do so. Humor, especially humor in the face of violence and violation, trauma and pain, is how we rise above the horror and free ourselves of its chains. Humor is a weapon against tyranny, a shield against despair. It is relief and a release. And laughter is humanity unfurled. Thanks for watching. Bye.